It is my distinct pleasure to introduce to you Dr. Parag Khanna. Dr. Khanna, he is a leading global strategic advisor, a world traveler, and a best-selling author. He is the founder and managing partner of FutureMap, a data and scenario-based strategic advisory firm. Parag's newest book is The Future is Asian: Commerce, Conflict, and Culture. It just came out this year, and from which we will be gaining from his insight over the course of the next 30 or 40 minutes or so. Dr. Khanna has provided expertise to numerous governments, including those of the United States, United Kingdom, Germany, Russia, Saudi Arabia, Japan, China, India, South Korea, among many others. He's been an advisor to the U.S. National Intelligence Council's Global Trends 2030 and has served in both Iraq and Afghanistan as a senior geopolitical advisor. He also has a great history with our host city, having been a senior research fellow at the Center on Asia and Globalisation at the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy here at the National University of Singapore, and now actually calls Singapore home. Dr. Khanna lectures frequently at international conferences. He gives tailored briefings to government leaders and corporate executives on global trends and scenarios, systemic risks, and technological disruptions, as well as market entry strategies and economic master planning. His 2008 cover story for the New York Times Magazine, titled "Waving Goodbye to Hegemony," is among the most globally debated and influential essays since the end of the Cold War. You'll also find him on TED Talks, where his talks have been viewed more than 3 million times. He's traveled to nearly 150 countries, providing him with a great deal of perspective to share with us today. So please join me in welcoming to the stage Dr. Parag Khanna.
Thanks very much. Thank you. Good evening, everyone. Good evening. Welcome to Singapore for those of you who've come a very long way. And I appreciate from looking at the various poster boards on the walls here that you've definitely been very, very hard at work today. And I hope that I can complement all of the thinking that you've been doing with some thoughts of my own, partially derived from The Future is Asian. But what I wanted to do is actually to give those of you, especially those who've come from abroad, an Asian view on the world. And that's very hard to do because there is no such thing as a composite or generic Asian view. This is the most diverse, heterogeneous region of the planet Earth. But that said, it just creates more work for you, really, to digest and to understand all of the different perspectives that go into appreciating what's happening in this region. The first point I want to make is simply a geographic one. I think for anyone in the maritime industry, geography is in some way, shape, or form in your blood. It's certainly in mine, and it's in my training. And one of the things that has actually bothered me about the writing about Asia in the last 20 years, as important as it is to continuously look at dynamics in Asia, is that it's been entirely China-centric, right? And there's good reasons to focus a lot about China, to write about China, to analyze China. I see one of your boards is a big, a rendition of China. It says biggest economy in the world. Yes. However, what I've seen is that when people talk about Asia or write about Asia, you'll get 298 pages of a 300-page book about China and 2 pages devoted to the other 3 billion people of Asia. And I think that that's a little bit of a shortcoming, if you will. And from the geographical standpoint, Asia is quite simply much larger than just China. This is the proper geographic understanding of Asia. I don't mean to, of course, claim that Scandinavia is part of Asia. So what we did was only put the names of the actual Asian geographic countries here on this map. So, and this Asian region has a lot of actual shared history that has been really buried for about 500 years. And what's very important that's happening today is that it's sort of resurfacing and there's new connections being created, and I want to talk to you about some of those. I also want to make a demographic point about why it's so important to understand the parameters of Asia. First is obviously geographic, then obviously demographic. Some say geography is destiny, others say demography is destiny, so I give you both, right? Now, if you go back 15, 20 years, many people made forecasts about the world population, that it might rise to 15 billion people in the coming decades. We have drastically revised those downwards. Many people, many parts of the world, and I think quite a few of you come from those regions of the world, that are experiencing pretty significant demographic deflation already. And the current projections or forecasts for the total or highest world population that we will achieve by around the late 2040s is under 10 billion people. So the majority of the world population is in fact here in this Asian geography, and that's actually always going to be the case. So we will never live in a world where the majority of the world population is not here in Asia. And of course, if you look at growth rates, if you combine infrastructure investment, urbanization, where the young populations of the world are, where the growth rates are, all of those indicators do point to this Asian region. So even if you have a slowing of the Chinese economy, and if Chinese companies are hurt by the trade war, whatever negative indicators people want to point to about China and say, well, this therefore means that the Asian story is off, that's wrong. That's incorrect, right? That's biased. That's far too narrow an interpretation. I want to give you a bigger story. So let's talk about what's happened in the last 30 years in Asia. Why 30 years? Well, very convenient timing. Here we are 1 week away from November the 9th. What happened on November the 9th, 1989? Yes, very good. Berlin Wall fell, right? So for those of us who come from Western countries, the last 30 years has gone by like this, and we can remember the highlights, whether it's the Saddam's invasion of Kuwait and the Gulf War, 9/11 terrorist attacks, Trump, Brexit, so on and so forth, right? But we don't pay as much attention, right, to, and within Asia, each country has a story. We know and been watching China's spectacular modernization, looking at India starting to catch up. Each individual Asian country obviously has its own experience for the past 3 decades. But there's also a collective story that has not been properly told. And this is just one slice of it right here. And it is the degree to which the trade networks that were present, and obviously not in this density or scale, for hundreds of years prior to colonialism, prior to the Cold War. So the last 500 years have been periods of Asia, really Asian countries, societies being splintered from each other. But since the last 30 years, particularly after 1991 with the collapse of the Soviet Union, Asian countries started to reconnect. A big part of the story is one that would be very familiar to the maritime industry, and that's obviously the commodity supercycle, right? It's the trade in energy from the West Asian countries, the Gulf countries in pink, over to East Asia, China, this region, Southeast Asia, Japan, Korea, and so forth. And that commodity supercycle is one of the key pillars of the last 30 years of international economic history in this region that has helped these countries, again, reconnect, stitch themselves back together, rekindle those old Silk Roads. Now today, after a mere 25 years, these Asian countries trade more with each other than they do with the rest of the world. Right? So China's #1 trading partner, if you will, isn't per se one country, but it trades much more with its neighbors than it does with the United States, than it does with Europe. And that's happened in a very, very short amount of time. In fact, intra-regional trade now accounts for 60+% of Asian trade. So only Europe, which is just a little bit higher, 65–70%, has more of a share of internal trade to its total trade. And we haven't been paying enough attention to this story. If you pick any blue line, any blue dyad on this map, I went back 15 years, 10 years, 5 years to look at these pairs of trade partners. Every single one of them has increased in its trade volume. So it shows you a couple of things. Importantly, it's not just China, right? Everyone is connecting to everyone and exploiting those complementarities. And that's the critical thing. Asian countries have tremendous complementarity with each other. You have commodities producers in terms of energy or food. You have industrial centers. You have technology centers. You have financial centers. You have countries that have aging populations, those younger populations. So in every conceivable way in which Asians can start to fill each other's gaps economically, again, in terms of commodities trade and so forth, Asians are starting to do that. In fact, they're already doing it in a very big way, and I believe that's going to accelerate tremendously. So there's huge consequences in terms of how this story plays out for infrastructure investment, for obviously development of ports, the maritime sector, and so forth, not least the various maritime corridors, which we'll talk about. And I wanted to make another point to highlight how in the last 75 years, last 80 years really, since the end of World War II, the Asian economic story has evolved, just to indicate again how you need to look ahead, not just to China's role, but the other growth markets as well. So the chapters or the waves of the Asian growth story really began with Japan, of course, after World War II. After World War II, it took only 25 years for Japan to become the world's second largest economy. And that modernization and industrialization is what inspired, in many ways, the tiger economies. Now, I think all of us have definitely grown up in an era where we're familiar with the tiger economies and their, again, rapid industrialization and becoming a center for global supply chains. That's when China enters the picture, right? After Japan, after South Korea, Taiwan, Hong Kong, and Singapore, which in many ways, again, inspired the Chinese story and, of course, have been among the largest, most loyal investors in China over the last 40 years since Shenzhen was named China's first special economic zone. So China enters this Asian story as the third wave of growth after Japan, after the tigers, then China. And again, for far too many people, this is the beginning, middle, and the end of Asia is what happens in China. What I want to argue to you is that there's an entire fourth wave of high growth economies here in Asia, represented by the countries in orange, from Pakistan through India, ASEAN. That's 2.5 billion people, by the way, right? It's not one country, but it is countries that each of which has a younger median age than China. So every single country, except for Thailand, whose median age is similar to China's, they're all substantially younger in median age than China. India will soon have a larger population than China. It's hard to do an effective census in India, so by all means, you might as well assume that India's population is already the same as China's. They'll never really know. And of course, you have, because even owing to dynamics prior to the trade war, with China's wages rising, Southeast Asia's wages much cheaper, you've had the shifting of supply chains out of China into these fourth wave Asian economies. Since before the trade war, it's certainly accelerated as a result of the trade war. So there's many dynamics, whether they're long-term, medium-term, or short-term, that are either coming from within in terms of the internal dynamics of economic reform and urbanization and growth, or external variables like the trade war that are helping to propel these fourth wave economies forward. So it would be a huge mistake, obviously, to ignore how important all of these countries in orange are as well in contributing to the broader growth story. If you measure Asian economies or the world economy in purchasing power parity terms, in other words, obviously, what prices Asians pay for generally speaking goods that are made in Asia by Asians, which of course are cheaper, you can see that the revision of the GDP statistics is quite substantial in favor of Asian economies. So, for example, going back to your image on the boards over there about China will be the world's largest economy in maybe 2030, well, if you look at it in PPP terms, obviously China is already the largest economy in the world, and India is not merely a $4 trillion economy, but an $8.7 trillion economy, and so forth. And this is crucial not because we need to debate economic methodology. This is important so that we all understand why it is that consumption is growing so rapidly in these countries, because historically we would expect that countries would have to be much richer in US dollar terms per capita before you see a real liftoff in consumption of consumer goods, or even people's uptake of financial services like mortgages and loans and things like that. But we see all of those things happening even in the poorest countries in Asia, that with $2,000, $3,000 a year income, because those things are more and more priced in those local currencies. In financial markets and in the financial system, one of the most significant things that's happened in the last 10 or 15 years is that Asian countries now borrow more in their own currencies than in US dollars. So that pressure that emerging markets, particularly Asian ones, have faced for decades that have high or outstanding US dollar debt, and any shift in US interest rate policy or currency has a very detrimental impact on them. That risk is now gone. So countries can make long-term plans and invest in the long term because they're borrowing 30-year bonds that are being issued in their own currency. And this is very critical and helps to drive that investment forward, even when you have the kinds of situations that we're in right now, where you have kind of a coordinated or synchronized downturn or slowing of the world economy. So we shouldn't treat global growth or the world economy as something that is sort of finite, as if it's zero sum. And that's very much the mentality that we tend to take on when we talk about the trade war today, and use that as the central lens to understand the world economy. But we shouldn't. What we should really understand is that we are in a single, what I would call a sort of supply chain system of the world, and we're all competing in what I call a tug of war over supply chains, and that is whether it is horizontally to be the producer or to control the distribution of goods and services, or vertically, which is in terms of providing the value added for those supply chains. So to me, this trade war is not just a single moment or an episode. If Trump and Xi meet in Chile and sign an agreement, that's not really the end of the trade war. To me, the trade war is a perpetual fact of life. Right? It is economic life, is a tug of war to control supply chains. And that happens in many ways through, for example, free trade agreements and trade liberalization. So what I'm showing you here with these circles are some of the major trade liberalization frameworks that are underway in the world today. So many of you are familiar with the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement. The US did a lot of, made a big effort to push that forward, and then ultimately didn't even join it, whereas all of the other signatories went forward. Pacific countries on both sides of the ocean, Latin America, North America, like Canada, Mexico, as well as Asian countries like Japan, and down to Australia and New Zealand. What I'm showing you in the middle, the countries in green, are those that have said, because most countries are not price setters, right? They're not able to dictate the path of these negotiations and agreements. They're price takers, and a small country like Singapore most certainly is. So they say they practice what's called open regionalism. They say we will participate in any and all trade liberalization frameworks. We want to be the beneficiaries. We want to be the winners from whatever agreement moves forward, such as, for example, the RCEP, which you see on the left, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, which is being ratified by countries across the region right now. So there's a joke that's sometimes told here in the region. It's a very nerdy joke, so I don't expect anyone to laugh, but it's the trade war is over and Vietnam is won. Right? And that's, oh, you actually laughed. So it's not my joke, so whoever gets the credit is someone else. But the point there is obviously, again, Vietnam is one of those countries right here that is, again, practicing this open regionalism, and therefore whichever way supply chains shift as a result of the new calculations that multinationals and firms are making, those countries tend to benefit because you can either directly export tariff-free from them to other partners who are participating in the agreement, or obviously the internal liberalization that's taking place with RCEP. So to me, there's a shift in geopolitics that's going on fundamentally. We don't see as many international territorial conflicts as we used to, and where they are, they're not sort of shifting the entire world order. What we're seeing much more is that connectivity is the tool, is really the medium that we're fighting over. Who is more connected to whom through trade agreements? And so I say there's a famous saying in geopolitics, who rules the heartland rules the world. That refers to the Eurasian terrestrial space, and I'll get into that in a minute. But I'm modifying that a little bit. I'm saying it's really about the supply chain, right? And competing over connectivity is the way in which powers sort of assert their influence in this century. So let's talk about how that's playing out in the maritime theater, because it's not really necessarily about territorial conquest and domination as it is about access to key nodes and ports, hubs, canals, transit points, and so forth, and how to make those as commercially frictionless for your goods as possible. So here you can see a map showing you which ports and which status of ownership or control China and Chinese state-owned companies have taken around the world, and it's obviously those that are the key transshipment points with China's trade partners. And China is at the moment, the top trade partner of more than 100 countries in the world versus about 40 or 50 for the United States. So they have a significant interest in doing this. Now, I'm interested in your point of view on the following, but what we've tended to find in the conversations around China and infrastructure and geopolitics is that at first we say, well, this is a terrible threat, and this represents, a sort of, debt trap diplomacy. This is the return of the British East India Company and so forth. But then we realize also that, well, what China is doing through these investments is making the global infrastructure of trade more efficient, right? By investing in, for example, in the energy sector, right? By in partnering in energy extraction, global commodities prices have come down. Right? And obviously by investing in port modernization, upgrading, it's creating more efficiency for the inflow and outflow of goods. So the Piraeus port in Greece stands out as an obvious example of this. Some years ago, I traveled there not long after Costco had made its investment. And it was really striking to me that, ordinary Greek people, as proud as they obviously are of their civilization, of their history, they were quite relieved to be working for Costco. Right? Because this was a place where workers aren't getting paid. You can see the dilapidated infrastructure of the terminals on the far side in yellow, and the newer Costco terminals in blue. And for them, basically, life has gotten better. Right, as a result of this Costco investment. And you probably know better than I would that the ranking of Piraeus in terms of its port volume in Europe has been steadily climbing, recovering, and it's somewhere in the top 20 now. So it's not a surprise that Mediterranean countries like Greece have been favorable towards either taking Chinese investment because they had to, but once they have, why not be part of the Belt and Road Initiative, for example? So you can see a clear divide, if you will, in Europe over this issue. It didn't surprise me earlier this year when Italy decided to join Belt and Road, for example. Not least because I went to Trieste a couple of years ago, and already China Merchant Bank and others were quite active in conversations about financing some of the upgrades for that port. And it's obviously not just the port, it's the intermodal infrastructure that helps to either connect to sites of manufacturing and production inland, as far inland as Hungary and so forth, and also obviously linkages across ports themselves, and that costs a lot of money to do. So in Trieste, in Italy, they were thinking, well, our sort of status as a port has fallen. What can we do to be a new gateway into Central Europe? And the reason that Germany, for example, has been so strongly opposed to countries like Italy joining Belt and Road is not because they genuinely believe that there should be some kind of a principled, united European policy towards China. They may believe that, but that's quite sort of hypocritical given just how much Germany trades with China and invests in China, and the reverse vis-a-vis its European neighbors. It's actually because if you look at a map and just take out a ruler, you would notice that Trieste is much closer to Munich than even Hamburg is to Munich. And it's the port of Hamburg that's telling Berlin, you need to get in the way, you need to stop Italy from joining Belt and Road and doing this, because suddenly you're going to have goods bound for southern Germany coming from Trieste rather than from Hamburg, right? So this is all very mercurial, if you will, and very self-interested. But the bottom line is that there is already, as you know well known, very active competition underway to be the critical node, the gateway for key interior geographies. And that's what's playing out in Europe, and why Belt and Road, the maritime dimension, should be considered as important as the terrestrial dimension, which I'll come back to. South China Sea, right here in this region. Very, very important. We do know how important the Straits of Malacca is right here as a critical sea lane. And these disputed waters, of all of the geopolitical scenarios that worry and keep a lot of us up at night, whether it is North Korea or China and Japan's dispute or Kashmir, whatever the case may be, this is probably the area that people think of as being the closest to conflict. Right now, the Chinese government is, quietly making efforts to try to, for lack of a more diplomatic term, buy off the Philippines to gain its acquiescence to an agreement where they would do joint energy exploration and do a profit share without necessarily legally resolving the status of the islands. And in the case of the Paracel Islands, which Vietnam has a very strong claim to, that kind of logic is not, or that kind of offer from China is not necessarily going to apply. But you could imagine them finding ways to collaborate commercially and in a way, in an attempt to push out, for example, U.S. energy providers. And that, if China can manage, and this is something that I think is going to be a priority for China in the next 12 to 18 months, this could have an impact on our perception of stability in the South China Sea, something that all of you are obviously watching very closely when you think about safe passage and the legal demarcations, the cost of insurance, and all of those issues. So I'm not, again, I would acknowledge on the one hand, this is probably the most dangerous and unpredictable geography in Asia. On the other hand, it's one where over the last 20 years, because to properly understand the conflict and the conflicts here, it's not just the last 6 months. We actually have had skirmishes going back even in sort of hostile ones to the early 1990s in this region. So that means that actually the countries that are participants here, as worrisome as the sort of escalations are, there's almost a 30-year history of also managing those tensions as well, which is not necessarily a bad sign. Now, going back to the Indian Ocean and how important that is going to play as a role in the maritime trade, because the super cycle may be over in the sense that commodities prices have come down, but the shipping volumes are certainly up. And you see this with the role of India because of its incredible growth at this point in time. The Modi administration is very, very active in promoting not only a look east policy, where it strengthened its military and economic ties with Japan, military ties with Vietnam as well, and also with Saudi Arabia and the Gulf countries. In fact, Modi is in Saudi Arabia right now for the FII summit, and there's been a lot of sort of multi-directional looking. So for those people who even just as recently as 2 or 3 years ago were forecasting that China is going to recreate the Ming Dynasty, and there will be treasure fleets sailing across the Indian Ocean, and this is going to be kind of the 16th century all over again. Not likely to be the case in light of India's very, very significant investments in its navy. Its merchant fleet as well, as we know China's is the largest, but India's is very, very substantial. I have relatives actually in the Indian merchant navy, so they remind me of this all the time, how much new investment is going into the commercial trade infrastructure there for India, and of course their naval modernization, submarines, warships, and so forth. So I find that the Indian Ocean is also going to be much more multipolar than people were predicting. And that could be a good thing in terms of the overall stability, because the British and the French, Americans, Indians, even Indonesia and others have a very strong interest in maintaining that openness. So even if China is there, it doesn't mean China is going to dominate. Another example in this regard is obviously the case of Sri Lanka. A couple of years ago, it was in vogue to say that because of the default or potential default on a loan to China, the Sri Lanka handed over a 99-year lease for operation of the Hambantota port. But in a short amount of time, that government in Sri Lanka fell, sort of the pro-China government led by Rajapaksa, and India decided that it would prioritize working with Sri Lanka to help, sort of wean Sri Lanka off of its dependence on China. So these diplomatic maneuvers make it, very unlikely that the unipolar sort of China logic is going to unfold. Instead, things will be much more multipolar. That applies as well in the Belt and Road context. So I'll just say a quick word about this. This map is kind of a rendering of some of the oil and gas pipelines, railways, and other infrastructures that are helping to tie together these countries, which, as I showed you earlier, have such intense and growing trade relations with each other. Now, again, this is an area where people see this as an offensive Chinese maneuver, but in many ways it's actually defensive, because China has been trying to get around this Malacca trap. So much of its trade or inflow of commodities and outflow of goods occurring through the Straits of Malacca. It's wanted to diversify that. I think you've probably read a lot of analysis about whether or not this is going to impinge on the how important maritime trade is. Again, not likely to be a threat by volume. in the near future. But it really is, again, a defensive maneuver to diversify the geography of supply chains. And it's, again, more importantly for you, I think, is that it's going to help to modernize countries that have not been active participants in the world economy, many of which are landlocked and need ultimately, whether overland or through maritime connectivity from interior areas down to coastal areas, are going to become more active participants. And where there is economic growth, ultimately there is opportunity for you to be servicing that directly or indirectly as an industry. But overall, I see that there is a shift in tone away from the fear-mongering around Belt and Road to acceptance of seeing it actually as win-win, despite the financial debts that are involved in some cases, not all. Because in a way, the countries that we're talking about, post-colonial countries that are overpopulated, that have not had new infrastructure in generations, they are not going to be able to invest in growth and infrastructure unless they borrow, right? It is inevitable to some degree. The question is, are they going to spend it wisely and grow their economies so they can pay off those debts? And there are quite a few countries that are doing that well, which is why both the RAND Corporation and Citigroup, two obviously American institutions, have used this phrase win-win, which is actually straight out of Xi Jinping's mouth, by the way, to describe Belt and Road. So I think that we need to take advantage of this rather than pretend that it is an initiative that could potentially fail because of a few instances of debt trap or a few geopolitical tensions emerging over it. I just want to move a little bit quickly, but on the western side of this map is of course Iran. Which many have portrayed as the last great emerging market in some ways. Obviously, right now, it's anyone's guess, if or when the Iranian market will open. But already you can see that they are modernizing their port infrastructure as east of the Strait of Hormuz in order to avoid any kind of disruption that would occur if there were a conflict in the Straits of Hormuz, and we've seen tensions rise, obviously, in recent weeks. So even in areas that are seemingly isolated, there is still this infrastructure activity that indicates that if and when those markets do open, it's going to be an important market and gateway. The Arctic as well, another critical theater for you. I just read today, and maybe some of you did as well, the New York Times report citing, or article citing some new research saying that the melting of the polar ice caps and sea level rise is going to be much more severe than we had predicted. And of course, we've seen that the sea ice melt in the Arctic has been a lot faster than we would have thought as well. Just in case, of course, you may also have seen just yesterday or day before, it was reported in the media that China is, or that Russia is floating these armored ice-breaking ships to sort of assert their sort of claims in the Arctic theater and to sort of be the protector is how they'd like to sort of portray themselves. This map shows you some of the Arctic routes that are going to thrive, and I think what's interesting here is the countries that are already thinking about their sort of port infrastructure. You can see that Canada obviously is one country that is focused on that in addition to Scandinavian countries. And I think that's going to lead to very rapid development or even a sort of thriving, a very rapid transition towards a greater usage of the Arctic theater faster than we would have thought. So overall, we have a picture where you have the Arctic off to the north of this map, the Belt and Road connections here in the middle, the Indian Ocean to the south, bringing together or helping to create a more frictionless environment for trade and exchange between these three centers of demographics and economic centers: Europe, Asia, and Africa. And it's really around the Indian Ocean. If you think about Southeast Asia, South Asia, Middle Eastern countries, and the east coast of Africa, this greater Indian Ocean trade was thriving in that period of history before colonialism, right? That's actually the period that historians call the Afro-Eurasian era. It's not a term that maybe any of you would have heard because it really doesn't apply to any period of history that we study all that regularly, right? The 16th century is the last time this term mattered, but it certainly matters again because these are the fastest growing economies in the world. So if you look at the volumes of trade across the Indian Ocean in CCS, right, cars, cement, steel, all of the industries that relate to these goods, there is a significant enhancement of trade, and Belt and Road projects, whether they're financed by China or whether it is the increasing lending and activity that is being undertaken by Japan or by India, all of this is going to facilitate that growth in trade. So overall, I see this as the critical macro geography for you to be sort of forecasting where your next investments are going to be, what the next centers of activity are going to be, what are the key commodities or goods that are in demand in these places. And that requires creating sort of a layering of maps, the way I like to do it, where you look at the functional geography of new infrastructure, you look at which cities are growing on the back of investments there, what new industries are receiving investment, where is either China or other foreign investors coming in and moving supply chains, where are young people going, and you can, each of those factors I just mentioned, you can actually physically, visually map. And when you layer them on top of each other, it continues to reinforce this point that this sort of meta-geography is going to be the key area of trade moving forward. So a final point is really, just to, in a way, a word almost philosophically about really how important the maritime industry is in creating a world that is actually more resilient. And the reason is because resilience is about having multiple pathways to get to your destination. Right? And when there are choke points, and I've highlighted 3 of them here, the Straits of Hormuz, the Suez Canal, the Straits of Malacca right here, historically, if you have a blockage in one of these choke points, that means that oil prices go soaring. There's a risk, obviously, of territorial maritime conflict. But today we find that even in instances like a few weeks ago, where we had the drone attack in Saudi Arabia, oil prices spiked, but they came back down again, because we live in a world of distributed supply and multiple ways for supply to reach demand. And all of the new infrastructure investments, whether it is Belt and Road Overland, whether it is the new maritime transportation routes and port investments, all of that contribute to this world of resilience. And there's a word that you may be familiar with if you're a fan of Nassim Taleb, who wrote The Black Swan. One of his more recent books is called Anti-Fragile. And an anti-fragile system is not just one that bounces back, right? That is, gets sick and then fixes itself. It's a system that gets better over time. And in that book, he talks about just a couple of examples of what are genuinely anti-fragile systems in the world. And one is human evolution, right? Think about it. We live longer, we're taller, stronger, and better nourished than we were 10,000 years ago, or even 500 years ago, right? And he also talks about globalization. Globalization has become an anti-fragile system. The more connections you have in the world, just like the internet, he also talks about the internet as an anti-fragile system. You cannot shut down the internet, right? The internet has many layers of redundancy, right? You can cut yourself off from the internet. 2 cables to Pakistan, for example, just were cut off in the last 24 hours. So everyone in Pakistan has slower internet access. But you cannot, not even the inventors of the internet can stop the internet. There's too many connections and too many pathways for information to flow. And so similarly with global infrastructure for the movement of goods, right? The more connectivity we build, the more anti-fragile a world we build, the stronger, more robust globalization becomes. And that is your role. In the world, in a world where we can, pinpoint the critical geographies of growth. I think it's for you to step up and make your contribution and continue to a world where that trade flourishes in a way that is, of course, sustainable. I know that's been a major theme today. That is secure, another theme that you have today. But most of all, those things can emerge from the competitive environment, but also building as much connectivity as possible. So I'll stop right there and look forward to our conversation. Thank you.
Would you like some water? All right. Thank you so much. So I have the privilege of getting to ask the first few questions, but then thereafter I'm going to turn it over to you to drive this discussion where it makes the most sense for you. So perhaps let's just have a quick seat, and then while you're thinking about what you would like to ask Dr. Khanna, you and I could start with a bit of a conversation. So a lot of interesting themes. That is going to leave our group with a great deal to work with as we consider what our role will be at a time of rising anti-globalization, increasing protectionism. We have these challenges, but ultimately the story and the maps that you weave show a story of demographics, connectivity, eventually overcoming some of the very real challenges that we currently face. Am I reading that correctly?
And in a way, that's a very safe bet because they always have. I mean, we wouldn't be here today if globalization does not always win, right? Because if you think about it, we have thousands of years of plagues, crusades, financial crises, world wars, and yet here we are, more globalized than ever. So, or rather, more connected than ever. It's connectivity that underpins globalization. So, whether you have a decline in the rate of trade growth in a certain period, that's globalization, and that indicator can sort of can modulate immigration volumes and that kind of thing. But the degree of connectivity we're expanding all the time, and that's undeniable when you think about all the infrastructure investment that's happening across borders. So, it's not an intentionally positive or optimistic story. I'm not an optimist by nature or sort of in a premeditated way. This is what is happening, and if it creates resilience, it's a byproduct of everyone acting in their own self-interest, actually. It's not because there is either a grand design or because there's a benevolent force out there. So I would say, at most, I'm an accidental optimist. But yeah, I do think that we are heading in this direction.
Would you claim realist?
Well, that's my training, right? So I mean, if I say that again, everyone is acting in their own interest, right? So China is not building these Belt and Road corridors to be generous, right? It's not building it because it genuinely believes that all of its neighboring countries deserves to be as rich as it has become. It's because they're in the way, right? They are on the way between China and Europe. And China trades a lot more with Europe than it does with the United States. And obviously, as a result of this trade war, that gap is going to grow. And if you look at the diversion, the way Chinese capital outflows have shifted now in the last few years, a very dynamic area, you can see how West Asian countries, Middle Eastern countries, have been among the strongest beneficiaries of the diversion of Chinese capital that had been invested in the United States. But as you very well know, Chinese FDI in the US has dropped from somewhere in the order of 100 billion a year to a marginal amount. And a lot of that has been redirected into Belt and Road economies. Mm-hmm. And in fact, whereas we look at the world through the lens of the trade war, and we look at how sort of tit for tat, retaliatory tariff escalations, we view that as the norm. Remember that China's surplus with Belt and Road partners has dropped to zero. So China is reducing tariffs. See, in the news, it's all about what's Chinese tariff policy with respect to the United States, but not its overall tariff policy. China has cut tariffs to everyone on Earth except the United States.
To increase its own economic resilience.
Exactly.
Yes.
Very much so. So if you come from a country that is not named the United States of America, China will happily reduce tariffs to you. And we see the numbers. China's trade surplus with BRI partners has gone way down. So there is this whole rest of the world out there, known from the Chinese point of view. You would know this, when you grow up in America, we have this acronym ROW, right? There's the US, there's Europe, and then there's ROW, rest of world, right? And maps will just have ROW. So in China, there's China, there's the US, there's Europe, and there's ROW. And when I was in Beijing a few months ago, their ROW is BRI, right? Belt and Road Initiative. Yep. The whole world has pretty much joined Belt and Road, except for a few countries in a very short amount of time. So when I was in Beijing a few months ago, I was asking a university dean about foreign students coming in. And he said, well, we've seen a kind of plateau in the number of Americans that we get, but from BRI, it's way up. So from the Chinese worldview, BRI is almost everyone. And it's sort of like, in a way, if you look at Huawei, right? Huawei has obviously been hurt by what's happened with the trade war to some degree, but the Huawei chairman has been quite resolute, and he said, look, we have the whole rest of the world. What he means is BRI. BRI is still open to them. And if you look at which countries are resisting Huawei or rejecting Huawei, most countries are still saying they're going to do business with Huawei, and many of them are Belt and Road participating countries. It's almost 100 countries.
Because they're looking to build that connectivity first and foremost, and that is in their own interest.
If you look at the impact of the cost of imports and of technology goods and the role of tariffs and the role they play in a country's modernization, the worst thing that a developing country can do for its own growth is to have high tariffs on technology imports, right? So if you are a developing country and you want your people to leapfrog, you want them to be educated, you want to have a flourishing services economy, a digital economy, you can't do that if the price of a laptop and a mobile phone and if the price of bandwidth is very high on your poor people. You should do whatever is in your power as much as possible, as fast as possible, to get your people connected. And if that means that Huawei is the cheapest, fastest, best option, most countries are going to go with that. And it's in their economic, developmental interest to do so. Obviously, there are these national security considerations. However, the fact is that every country has a different perception of how important those are. Not every country's secrets are equally valuable, right? And a lot of countries don't really put that front and center in their calculations. Evidently, that's why they're working with Huawei.
Well, also I think the development of domestic prosperity and connectivity trumps any sort of concerns that they might have over the national
Exactly
security.
right.
Okay, yes. So I'm going to ask you two questions within one, and then I'm going to take it to the floor to drive the conversation with you from there. So the first one is, what should be the global maritime industry strategy to effectively engage that fourth wave of high growth economies? So these were the South and Southeast Asia economies that all the countries but China, Northeast Asia, that Parag, you were suggesting that we need to be spending more time and attention and investing in that fourth wave. And I think it also maps very nicely, if I will, to the return to Afro-Asia, which you close with as well.
So, I'm obviously very bullish on ASEAN, but I don't want to sugarcoat how underdeveloped much of the region is. This greater Asian region of 4+ billion people still has about 2 billion very poor people in it, mostly in these fourth wave countries of India, Pakistan, and Southeast Asia. And these countries have a very low standard of technology. Other than in some of the digital technology areas where you see a rapid leapfrogging, their physical infrastructure is very, very poor. For those who haven't been to Sumatra, let's say, which you can almost sort of kind of see from here if you look south, this is Indonesia's largest island, has a population of 40 million people, which is less obviously than Java, which is much smaller and has 140 million people. But it's a completely underdeveloped, huge sort of geography. And the port infrastructure of all of Indonesia, which is obviously a very substantial and broad archipelago.
17,000 islands.
Something like that.
17,000 islands.
Who's counted them all? I
They
haven't,
have.
but there's
they
a lot.
have. They will remind you.
Yeah.
17,000.
So they've counted them, but not much else, right? Because they certainly haven't built, sort of functional infrastructure on them. So port infrastructure has been a critical, priority for the Jokowi government, but it's already had one term and done extraordinarily little in this regard, right? Even some of the ideas around like bridges to connect some of the islands, like the Sunda Bridge and so forth, these things haven't yet really, fully materialized. So everything goes very slow, and that's because whereas, when we think about it from the standpoint of European history or American history, the public sector has played a dominant role either in financing infrastructure or in creating the right incentives for private investment in that infrastructure. But we tend to think of it as a public good, which the government provides. Certainly anyone who's European, that's the orientation you come from. That's not going to happen as much here in Asia. Even though countries like Indonesia have improved their kind of macroeconomic fundamentals, they have decent currency reserves. I mentioned long-term borrowing and so forth. But the ability to translate sort of a policy into reality is very slow. So I think there is an important role for the private sector to create the kinds of financial instruments or joint ventures that are going to help or to almost push the government to make those initial first steps into building out the kind of infrastructure that's going to help you ultimately to be the key conduits between these many Indonesian islands and the rest of the world.
Yeah,
And that's just Indonesia. The same thing applies to other countries.
I think this is a critical point because I think sometimes in industry we forget that governments, particularly in emerging market economies, they will take your input. They're interested in what you think would be the best kind of infrastructure investments that they can make. And so when you're thinking about your engagement strategies and when you are meeting with either government or industry associations, sharing your views on potential plans that that country government might be considering for where and how to spend infrastructure monies. This is the kind of perspective that they don't readily have domestically, and they would really value your opinion.
I'd go much further.
How
You're
so?
absolutely right, but
Yes.
DHL teaches customs authorities in this region how to do border and customs management to be more efficient. They tell them how to do it, and countries are grateful that DHL has helped them do that, right? Banks basically prescribe, or I don't want to say write the laws, because when you're American, the idea of companies writing laws is something that we know happens a bit too much. However, when you're talking about countries that are so underdeveloped in terms of their financial markets and their ability to understand capital market regulation and how to get their stock exchanges linked to each other, they need the banks to actually come in and do it for them. And the technical expertise that is in this room, that is embodied in your sector, is something that all of the governments, many of the governments in this region also need. So it's more actually than just that. Yes, they're opening to listening, but it's more than that. They really need your help to do it with them and almost for them.
That could be a great opportunity. So at this point, we're going to move to the floor, and I'd love to take questions from you. Oh, we've got the first one down over here. Yes. We also have microphones.
Sure. Absolutely.
Oh,
can I?
Here we go. First one here.
Hi, Parag. How are you? Hey. You talked about the sort of optimistic narrative, resilience through connectivity. How much do you worry about some of the things that are talked about, protests against inequality, viruses, whether cyber or real, and climate stress?
Right. Oh, these are great questions. We didn't talk enough about climate change. Let me take a couple of these in maybe reverse order. Climate change is definitely the biggest threat to this region. Mentioned just briefly what we've been reading in the media today, and I think that what worries me is that whereas I applaud Asia for leading the world now in infrastructure investment, infrastructure stimulus, and as necessary it has been, so much of it is going to prove to have been in the wrong places, right? And that's why Indonesia is saying they're going to have to move their capital, for example. Bangkok, obviously. If you fly out of next time you do happen to find yourself in Bangkok and fly out of Bangkok, if you're flying south, count the number of seconds between when you leave the airport and when you see nothing but swamp below you, and it's less than 30 seconds, right? Very, very problematic. So what Asian countries lack most of all is not the money to invest in infrastructure, but the strategy for resilient infrastructure, where to build, taking into account the externalities around issues like climate change that they have not factored in the first wave of trillions of dollars of investment that they've been making over the last couple of decades. And there's A, that's not happening, and B, it's not coordinated, certainly not well coordinated. And the Asian diplomacy that should be much stronger than it is around climate resilience. How can they do more around technology transfer, clean energy, and all of these kinds of things that Asians, particularly, for example, Japan, can teach other countries, and technologies it can sell to other countries, China too. And that there isn't yet a fluid and intense mechanism for that. That's one area of Asian diplomacy that is desperately necessary. So I'm glad you drilled down on that point. Inequality is, as bad here in Asia or even in ASEAN as anywhere on Earth. If ASEAN were a country, it would be by far, by many, many, many orders of magnitude, the most unequal country on Earth, right? You have the richest countries on Earth here, and you have the poorest on Earth here. So, and yet I don't think that inequality is what drives day-to-day conversation, because we still have 2 billion poor people, right? And so I think that the mentality in Asia, by and large, is a constructive one that says, look, we've got a lot of work to do still. Obviously, in a world of financial globalization, you will have billionaires and so forth. But what are we doing in terms of raising the floor? And so, poverty is the focus more than inequality overall. And I think that's the way it should be, is the focus on poverty. And so I applaud by and large, and that's why you're seeing the continuity of the elected Asian governments. We've just had elections in India, in Indonesia, in the Philippines, right? 3 countries where the campaign slogan has been identical, right? It's infrastructure, it's jobs, right, and so forth. And you're getting, governments will sort of live or die or rise and fall by their commitment to those goals, and therefore that's why they're getting a sort of a longer shelf life, more trust, from leaders. And Modi has a high approval rating. Duterte does as well. It's because they're seen to be making, having an impact on these issues. So even if there is high inequality, they're still tackling the poverty issue, and I think that's why. The first part of your question was about. Oh, right. So I mean, I think that this is an area where you get the good with the bad. But if you look at even just pandemics, right? The alarm that's raised over each one, inspires a kind of very significant counter reaction to isolate, its impact, and we've seen this now time and time again. So I think that globalization, or managing it right, is about flow and friction, right? Increasing friction for the bad stuff and increasing flow of the good stuff. And I do think we have the capacity, to manage that, and it's being proven in this area of infectious diseases.
Great. We got a question right up here.
Ravi Malhotra, thanks, Khanna, for excellent. I have two small questions. First is, you have given the time frame is the 21st century, 80 years are still left. Can you narrow it, because to come in our comprehension of that? The second question is, don't you think the Road and Belt Initiative is against the shipping industry? And we are all in shipping. So it is not in our interest that it should develop. Thank you.
So in terms of timeframes, I don't think that, I used a lot of historical, markers, like the rise of Japan after World War II, and 40 years since Shenzhen was declared China's first special economic zone, 30 years since the fall of the Berlin Wall, 20 years since the Asian financial crisis. It's not really about declaring a moment in time, right? So again, according to investment banks, 2020 is the year that Asia represents 50% of global GDP. The Belt and Road Summit, for many people, symbolizes an Asia-centric or China-centric outbound diplomatic system that's incorporating more than 100 countries. So there are many milestones along the way to Asia taking center stage. To me, it really doesn't matter what sort of year one puts on it. And I do not think it actually makes sense to make predictions for 30, 40 years from now. Scenarios, yes. Potential forecasts, yes. But actual predictions, may not be around to know whether we were right or wrong. So that's less important. But Belt and Road is the kind of thing that, again, unfolds over a decades-long time frame. Many of the projects that I depicted on that map, I've personally gone and visited going back 15 years. So before Belt and Road had a name, I had written, literally in my first book, 15 years ago, I went to Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan and Russia and looked at Chinese infrastructure projects. It didn't need a name for it to be happening. It's an organic process of these countries reconnecting. And it's going to continue to unfold. There's no doubt about it. But as I said before, it's only if you view the volume of trade in the world as a finite size pie, and it comes down to how much of it is overland and how much of it is maritime, and it's exactly zero sum, then you would say that this is bad for shipping. But that's not the way the world economy evolves. You have new centers of growth, new demographic centers as well, entering the world economy that have not been participating in a very long time. So you do have a overall growing pie. Many of them are desperate to be more connected, and that requires a maritime infrastructure. And obviously, they're going to be more, importers and consumers of goods. And Belt and Road can't be reduced in any case only to what's happening across Russia, for example, because so much of it is, in fact, maritime in nature. And it's unlocking more commodities that are being moved and shipped around the world. So it still would be premature to say that it is, going to be bad for shipping. Overall, the fate of the shipping industry depends much more on geopolitics and on economic growth than on whether or not, the trade routes are expanding in their scope or not.
All right, great. We have a couple of questions over here.
Hi, thanks for your talk. I think it was really illuminating, especially the amount of context you gave to the global shipping sector, global maritime industry. I think one of the slides that was most revealing to me in terms of now actually seeing it mapped was the Chinese bought ports throughout the world, strategic strongholds, and you're talking a lot about physical infrastructure, of course, super important. Have you researched and perhaps overlaid as well the digital infrastructure China is also selling to all of these countries, particularly Asia and Africa, and the role that what we would call, for example, totalitarian or authoritarian technology or infrastructure will also play with the physical infrastructure?
Yep, great question. So the so-called digital Silk Road is also, again, not necessarily new. So when I mentioned Huawei and 5G, what some of the trouble that the U.S. and allies are facing in trying to convince countries not to work with Huawei is that actually Huawei is already there, right? It's been there for a long time, and the first generation or the base infrastructure that countries have in their telecommunications sector may be partially or entirely Huawei. That's true even in Germany, right? So that's part of the issue. The second, though, is that I think that these things play out in a much more complicated way than simply saying, if Chinese telecommunications infrastructures in a country, therefore China owns that country, or whatever the case may be. Countries can regulate their telecommunication sectors and their internet regulation, so that even if you have fixed infrastructure that's built by one company, you can certainly have a competitive market environment for the services that are provided on top of that. And that's something that, for example, Singapore is doing. It's making sure that there's open competition around the 5G services that are going to be built in the country. And one would hope that more and more countries are going to ensure that they demand a sort of interoperable or open standards around how infrastructure, 5G infrastructure, is built, so that later on other companies can sort of coordinate or compete and build on the same platform, and that there's obviously open competition around the telecom services. So it's really too complicated an issue to simply say that whoever builds whoever lays down the cable sort of owns the country. Separately, in terms of technology services or digital services, yes, of course, there's a wide range of these things. It could be everything from countries participating in the Alibaba World Trade Platform, as they're calling it, WTP, which has by and large been good for many countries because they get on this services exchange, this SME platform. So SMEs, which are the backbone of many developing economies, are able to participate in Alibaba's very smooth logistics framework with participating countries, and that's good for their revenue. It's good for their exports. So it's positive for them to be part of that story. If their governments are separately, and it is quite separate, buying certain surveillance technologies from other Chinese vendors, that's something that they may or may not do. And it may be something that is going to be abused by some countries. Other countries may not be buying it at all. Other countries are doing it on their own without Chinese help. And in some of those same countries, having done so could lead to a political backlash and revolution and the fall of those governments. So again, I think we have to be very nonlinear about these things and not expect that. Again, I always go back to the Sri Lanka example. Sort of 2 years ago, every single analyst and newspaper in the world said Sri Lanka is becoming a wholly owned subsidiary of China. And it took only a matter of months for an election to change the entire dynamics in Sri Lanka. And it's not likely that even if a future government leans towards China, that they would allow China to do the kinds of things in terms of stationing military forces there and so forth that China might have expected and that the previous Sri Lankan government may have promised. So, we can apply the same logic to the technology sector, and these things can change as governments sort of awaken to the risks if they do face them. And again, at the same time, there is this growing competition because Huawei's role in 5G and the U.S. response to it has awakened, Japan and Scandinavian countries, Finland, obviously Nokia and others, to want to compete more in this space, right? So we can't really say that there's only one vendor out there and it's China or no one. This is going to become, as with the built environment, right? In fact, just a couple of weeks ago, I was in Brussels when Shinzo Abe was there signing the EU-Japan Sustainable Infrastructure Finance Initiative, right? So this was portrayed as a rival to Belt and Road. So in just a couple of years, right, we've gone from this mentality of China is kind of, sort of dominates the playing field in all of these different sectors and services to a world where actually there's competition coming from all over the world in each and every one of these sectors and services.
Competition leading to greater connectivity,
yeah.
I think. We have one last question over here.
Dr. Khanna, could you tell us a bit more of your thoughts on China's development itself? So China has an economy in nominal terms of about $14 trillion, $10,000 per capita. They'd like to get up to sort of South Korean levels, $30,000 a capita, but meantime the government's becoming increasingly centralized and, should we say, dictatorial. To what extent do you think an increasingly dictatorial government will act as a constraint on China's ability to grow its economy significantly?
Well, I mean, by many sort of, you can quantify some of these indicators, and people have. It already is a strain, right? So, sort of misallocation of resources means suboptimal growth, and we've already seen this with the, many people point to overinvestment, if you will, and part of their response to the trade war has been, yet again, more investment-led stimulus, potentially, in areas where it's not really necessary. So, inefficiency in capital allocation is one of the common flaws, well, actually, of all governments, but but this one too. But China has the money to can make those mistakes, right, and still move on. So I think that obviously here's the way I approach it. It's almost from a demographic and psychological standpoint. If you're expecting to see a groundswell of uprising and revolution in a country like China against the government because it is authoritarian, you're looking in the wrong country. Because if you think about it, on the one hand, we say that they're an aging society, right? So let's look at aging people. Do aging people who have witnessed, now a generation and a half of stability want to destroy their political order just for the sake of it when they don't know what's going to come next? Absolutely not. These aging people have direct living memory of the Cultural Revolution and the Great Leap Forward. They don't want that. They don't want chaos. Meredith, you served in China. You know very well that Chinese people are very well schooled in their own history, and they know that when they don't sort of have a united system, there can be long-lasting spasms of chaos, and that's obviously not good for anyone. So, older Chinese, if you're looking for revolutionaries amongst the older Chinese, no. Disaffection, sure. Some dissatisfaction, absolutely, with a wide number of things. But local corruption tends to be the issue that Chinese are more animated by than sort of federal level corruption.
And I would say even within sort of a more authoritarian style system, I think you would even find that the Chinese government is definitely dialed into the concerns of their constituents. They just address them, and they're dialed into them in a different way than Western forms of government. But we've seen this increased sensitivity with rising connectivity among the Chinese population. The government's listening and paying attention to what people are concerned about. And certainly the efforts to lower levels of poverty, to go after corruption, which is, I know, a chronic issue, but still it's a key focus of the Xi Jinping administration. That's hugely popular among the Chinese people, even if they would like to have greater freedoms in other spaces that they might not be receiving underneath the current administration. So I think we just need to be accepting of China's model as different than other governing models, and that China is going to continue being China. And it can be China and still be receptive to the needs and the desires and the wants of the people that the government is trying to serve.
I'll add one point to that, which is that just remember that the China's system is unique to China, and there are certain things that other countries that are looking at China's development over the last 40 years have adopted from it, especially economic zones, industrial policy, and so forth. But they don't necessarily want to live under a Chinese-style system of government. And I just always like to remind people coming to Asia that more people live in democracies in Asia than in the whole rest of the world. And that's something that's very often forgotten. But I mentioned earlier just India, Indonesia, and the Philippines that just had elections. That's 1.8 billion people, to say nothing of Japan and South Korea. And if you want to include Australia and New Zealand, there are gold standard democracies in Asia. And most people in Asia do live in democratic societies, not in China. And the more information they have about how much more difficult life has become in China, or how much more authoritarian it's become, the less obviously they would want to live under a Chinese-style system. And that actually contributes to this broader pattern I'm describing, where actually countries are much more on guard about what China is doing in its own country and what it could do to its neighbors, which is why they're trying to strengthen and reinforce themselves, a hedge in a way against China. And that's what will ultimately lead to Asia being more multipolar rather than more dominated by China.
Increasing their connectivity, increasing their resiliency, increasing choice for the world's largest emerging middle-class population, the consumer class that we will increasingly be serving through our maritime shipping trade. Dr. Parag, Khanna, thank you so much for your time. Very insightful discussion.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you. Thank you.